March 22, 1945, Remagen, Germany. The Rhine River stretches like a steel ribbon between the advancing American forces and the heart of Nazi Germany. German officers peer through binoculars from concrete bunkers, confident in their defenses. Radio static crackles through Wehrmacht communications as commanders report positions along the west wall. The sound of boots echoes on frozen ground as sentries patrol the riverbank, breath visible in the cold morning air. German high command believed the Rhine would halt the Allied advance for weeks, perhaps months. Their calculations showed traditional river crossings would be slow, costly, vulnerable to artillery. Engineers had prepared demolition charges on every bridge. Anti-tank guns commanded every approach. Yet across the dark water, something unexpected was stirring. Amphibious vehicles the Germans had never seen deployed in such numbers, trucks that could drive directly through water as easily as across land. They called them DUKWs. The Germans called them impossible. This miscalculation would cost them the war. Winter had settled hard along the Rhine by February 1945. German engineers worked in shifts, reinforcing positions that stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Every bridge carried demolition charges. Every crossing point bristled with anti-tank guns and machine gun nests. The river itself, swollen with spring snowmelt, moved fast and cold, a natural moat protecting the Reich's industrial heartland. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt studied maps in his headquarters, marking defensive positions with confident strokes. Wehrmacht intelligence reports showed Allied forces massing across the river, but German calculations remained optimistic. River crossings required time, massive preparation, vulnerable pontoon bridges. The Rhine had stopped armies for centuries. German defensive doctrine relied on proven methods, concrete steel, and the assumption that enemies would attack conventionally. Rundstedt's staff estimated any Allied crossing would take weeks to organize, providing ample time for counterattacks. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western fortress, had been designed to channel attacks into predictable killing zones. Yet across Ebert, the Rhine American quartermasters were cataloging strange inventory lists. Hundreds of six-wheeled vehicles sat in staging areas, vehicles that looked like trucks but carried propellers. American soldiers called them ducks, an affectionate name for the DUKW amphibious transport. German intelligence had noted these vehicles in Normandy landings but dismissed them as coastal assault tools, irrelevant to inland operations. This assumption would prove catastrophic. The Americans were preparing to drive their trucks directly through the river. The DUKW emerged from American industrial innovation, born in 1942, when military planners recognized the need for vehicles that could transition from ship to shore without stopping. General Motors designed the six-wheeled amphibian around a proven truck chassis, adding a boat hull and marine propeller. The designation DUKW came from GM's engineering codes, D for 1942, U for utility body, K for all-wheel drive, W for dual rear axles. By 1945, American factories had produced over 21,000 DUKWs. Each vehicle could carry 2.5 tons of cargo or 25 fully equipped soldiers. On land, they traveled 50 miles per hour. In water, 5.5 knots. The combination seemed modest, but military logistics experts understood the revolutionary implications. No more vulnerable beaches, no more delays transferring cargo from ships to trucks. Colonel George Roach, senior logistics officer for the European theater, had seen DUKWs prove themselves in Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. His reports to Eisenhower's staff emphasized their potential for river operations. While German defenders focused on bridges and conventional crossing points, DUKWs could simply drive around obstacles, approaching from unexpected directions. Production statistics told the story of American industrial capacity. In 1944 alone, American factories delivered 4,508 DUKWs to European operations. Each vehicle represented 13,000 pounds of steel, 400 man-hours of assembly, and sophisticated waterproofing technology German industry could no longer match. The numbers reflected deeper truths about democratic industrial power. German intelligence files contained scattered references to amphibious trucks, but Wehrmacht analysts categorized them as specialized equipment for beach operations. No German planner imagined hundreds of trucks driving across rivers like the Rhine, carrying invasion forces directly into the Reich's heartland. The oversight would cost Germany everything. German defensive preparations revealed the Wehrmacht's fundamental misunderstanding of American logistics capabilities. Staff officers at Army Group B headquarters moved red pins across maps tracking Allied divisions, predicting conventional assault patterns. Their intelligence suggested Americans would attempt crossings at major cities where existing infrastructure could support massive operations. Wehrmacht engineers prepared accordingly. They mined approaches to Cologne, Koblenz, and Mainz. Demolition teams rehearsed bridge destruction sequences. Artillery units ranged their guns on likely crossing sites. The defensive plan assumed Allied forces would need established harbors, existing roads, and predictable supply lines. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, reviewed these preparations with growing confidence. His forces had been bloodied in the Ardennes offensive, but the Rhine represented a chance for redemption. The river would force Americans to attack predictably, allowing concentrated defensive fire. German assumptions rested on European military tradition. Previous Rhine crossings by Romans, Napoleon, Kaiser Wilhelm's armies had required massive engineering efforts and months of preparation. Modern warfare had not changed these fundamentals, German planners believed. Rivers remained barriers that channeled attacks into vulnerable bottlenecks. American quartermasters thought differently. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Barnes, supervising DUKW operations, understood that amphibious vehicles transformed the tactical equation. Instead of crossing at defended bridges, Americans could emerge anywhere along hundreds of miles of riverbank. Instead of vulnerable pontoon bridges, they would use vehicles that carried their own bridges. The psychological impact remained uncalculated. German soldiers expected to fight Americans approaching slowly across exposed water. Instead, they would face trucks emerging from the river like mechanical sea monsters, disgorging infantry and equipment at impossible speed. March 1945 would demonstrate how completely German commanders had misjudged their enemy's capabilities. The scale of American DUKW deployment astounded even Allied planners. By March 1945, the 12th Army Group had concentrated 847 amphibious vehicles along the Rhine front, the largest assemblage of such equipment in military history. Each DUKW represented not just transportation, but tactical flexibility German defenders could not match. American logistics officers understood numbers German quartermasters could only dream of achieving. Daily DUKW operations moved 2,100 tons of supplies across water obstacles. The vehicles operated around the clock, their waterproofed engines enabling continuous operations regardless of weather. German supply vehicles, meanwhile, struggled with fuel shortages and mechanical failures. Captain John McMahon of the 27th Dalmite Armored Infantry Battalion recorded detailed observations of DUKW capabilities in his after-action reports. The vehicles could navigate water obstacles that stopped conventional trucks, approach objectives from unexpected directions, and maintain supply lines that bypassed traditional defensive positions. McMahon noted that a single DUKW company could outperform an entire German transport battalion. The human element remained crucial. American DUKW crews trained extensively in amphibious operations, understanding their vehicles' capabilities and limitations. German defenders, by contrast, had no experience countering amphibious assault vehicles in inland operations. Wehrmacht training manuals contained no procedures for engaging trucks emerging from rivers. Technical superiority multiplied tactical advantages. American DUKWs featured waterproof electrical systems, corrosion-resistant components, and standardized maintenance procedures. German vehicles of similar vintage suffered from material shortages, substitute components, and improvised repairs that reduced reliability. The strategic implications cascaded through both armies. Americans could maintain offensive momentum regardless of bridge conditions or conventional crossing sites. Germans faced an enemy that could appear anywhere along the riverfront, forcing impossible defensive calculations. As March 1945 progressed, these accumulated advantages would transform tactical possibilities into strategic revolution. March 7, 1945, 3:47 p.m. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. Staff Sergeant Alexander Drebik of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion became the first Allied soldier to cross the Rhine on foot. But within hours, DUKWs were following a different route entirely. While German attention focused on the captured bridge, amphibious vehicles began crossing both upstream and downstream, creating multiple breaches in the defensive line. German radio intercepts from that day revealed Wehrmacht confusion. Field commanders reported strange vehicles emerging from the river carrying American soldiers. Initial reports described the DUKWs as amphibious tanks or floating trucks, terms that conveyed German bewilderment more than tactical understanding. The first DUKW crossing carried elements of the 9th Infantry Division directly onto the eastern bank, bypassing German positions entirely. Within 4 hours, these vehicles had transported 400 combat-equipped soldiers across the Rhine, establishing 3 separate beachheads that German forces could not contain simultaneously. American operational tempo overwhelmed German response capabilities. While Wehrmacht commanders debated how to counter the captured bridge, DUKWs were delivering artillery pieces, ammunition, and medical supplies to American forces already fighting on the eastern bank. The vehicle's ability to transition seamlessly from water to land eliminated the vulnerable transfer points that characterized conventional river crossings. German counterattacks, when they came, targeted the wrong objectives. Luftwaffe aircraft struck at the Remagen Bridge, while American supplies flowed across the river miles away from the bombing. Artillery concentrated on visible crossing points, while DUKWs emerged from unexpected sectors, disgorging infantry behind German defensive positions. The tactical revolution was complete within 24 hours. American forces had not merely crossed the Rhine, they had demonstrated that the river itself was irrelevant to their operational planning. German defensive doctrine, built around controlling key terrain, had become obsolete in a single day. German attempts to counter DUKW operations revealed the Wehrmacht's inability to adapt to amphibious warfare. Artillery observers trained their guns on traditional crossing sites, while American vehicles emerged from unexpected directions. Machine gun positions commanded fields of fire that DUKW simply avoided by approaching from different angles. The psychological impact on German defenders proved as devastating as the tactical failure. Soldiers who had confidently manned positions along the Rhine found themselves facing an enemy that materialized from the river itself. Wehrmacht training had prepared them for conventional assaults, infantry advances across bridges, engineer units constructing pontoons under fire. Nothing had prepared them for trucks driving out of water. Lieutenant Werner Schultz of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division recorded his unit's confusion in letters home that Allied censors would later capture. "The Americans come from the water like spirits," he wrote. "Our guns point at bridges while their vehicles cross everywhere. We cannot stop what we cannot predict." German defensive calculations had assumed Allied forces would require substantial preparation time before crossing attempts. Wehrmacht intelligence estimated any river assault would involve days of preliminary bombardment, engineer reconnaissance, and logistical buildup. DUKWs eliminated these preparatory phases, enabling immediate assault capabilities that German planners had not considered possible. The numerical disparity compounded German disadvantages. American forces deployed hundreds of amphibious vehicles simultaneously, creating multiple crossing points that overwhelmed available defensive resources. German commanders faced impossible choices: concentrate forces against visible threats while DUKWs crossed unopposed elsewhere, or spread defenses thin and failed to stop anything effectively. By March 10th, German situation reports acknowledged the scope of the crisis. The Rhine defensive line had not merely been breached, it had been rendered meaningless. American amphibious vehicles had transformed a natural barrier into a tactical highway. The Wehrmacht's faith in defensive positions would never recover from this demonstration of American technological superiority. The logistical impact of DUKW operations created a cascade of military advantages that German forces could not match. While Wehrmacht supply lines struggled with fuel shortages and partisan attacks, American amphibious vehicles maintained continuous delivery of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment directly to combat units. Statistics from March 12, 1945, illustrated the disparity. American DUKWs delivered 847 tons of supplies across the Rhine in a single 24-hour period. German supply vehicles, by comparison, managed only 190 tons for the entire Army Group B on the same day. The fourfold advantage in logistics translated directly into sustained combat effectiveness. Master Sergeant Robert Chen of the 83rd Quartermaster Company supervised DUKW loading operations throughout the Rhine campaign. His daily reports documented the vehicle's reliability under combat conditions. Despite German artillery fire and occasional Luftwaffe attacks, DUKW availability rates exceeded 90%, far better than any conventional truck unit operating under similar stress. The human cost of logistical failure weighed heavily on German units. Wehrmacht soldiers received reduced rations while American forces maintained full field kitchens. German wounded waited hours for medical evacuation while American casualties received immediate treatment from supplies delivered by DUKW. The contrast affected morale as much as combat effectiveness. Technical superiority enabled tactical innovation. American commanders used DUKWs to establish forward supply depots on the eastern bank, positioning ammunition and fuel closer to advancing units than German logistics could support for defensive forces. The amphibious vehicle's ability to navigate damaged terrain and water obstacles created supply lines that German interdiction could not effectively target. German attempts to disrupt DUKW operations failed consistently. Artillery strikes against river crossing points hit empty water, while vehicles operated elsewhere. Air attacks concentrated on visible bridges, while amphibious trucks crossed without infrastructure support. The Wehrmacht was learning a harsh lesson about industrial warfare. Logistics determined combat outcomes more decisively than tactics. By March 15, 1945, German commanders acknowledged defeat along the Rhine, but the implications extended far beyond tactical failure. The DUKW operations had demonstrated American capabilities that fundamentally altered Wehrmacht strategic planning. If rivers could not stop Allied advances, no natural obstacle remained viable for defensive operations. Field Marshal Model's Army Group B issued withdrawal orders that revealed the scope of German desperation. Units that had held Rhine positions for months received commands to conduct fighting withdrawal to secondary defensive lines. The phrase masked a more difficult truth. No secondary lines could withstand American amphibious assault capabilities. American operational success accelerated German collapse through cumulative effects. Each successful DUKW crossing enabled additional crossings by providing fire support and supply bases. The vehicle's ability to establish multiple beachheads simultaneously prevented German forces from concentrating defensive efforts effectively. The psychological impact on Wehrmacht leadership proved as destructive as battlefield losses. Generals who had built careers on defensive expertise faced an enemy that rendered their knowledge obsolete. Traditional military engineering, obstacles, barriers, defensive positions meant nothing against vehicles that drove through water. German soldiers' letters home, intercepted by Allied intelligence, described the devastating effect of DUKW operations on unit morale. "The river that was supposed to protect us protects no one," wrote Corporal Hans Muller of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division. "The Americans drive their trucks anywhere they choose. We cannot stop them because we cannot predict them. Industrial capacity determined the campaign's outcome more than military skill." American factories had produced thousands of amphibious vehicles while German industry struggled to maintain basic equipment. The DUKW represented democratic production capability that totalitarian economics could not match. March 1945 marked the Wehrmacht's final recognition that Germany had lost the industrial war. The Rhine's fall to amphibious trucks symbolized the Reich's inability to counter American technological and manufacturing superiority. The war's end was now simply a matter of time. The Remagen breakthrough catalyzed a transformation in Allied operational tempo that German forces could not match. Within 72 hours of the initial crossing, American DUKWs had established supply lines supporting 3 full divisions on the Rhine's eastern bank. The vehicle's ability to maintain continuous operations regardless of bridge status eliminated the Wehrmacht's last hope of containing the Allied advance. Numbers told the story of German defeat. By March 20th, American forces had transported 15,000 soldiers and 2,400 tons of equipment across the Rhine using amphibious vehicles alone. German forces facing this assault received 340 tons of supplies during the same period, a ratio that made sustained resistance impossible. General Omar Bradley's war diary recorded the strategic implications of DUKW success. "The amphibious trucks have eliminated the Rhine as a military obstacle," he wrote. "German defensive planning based on river barriers is now completely obsolete. We can cross water obstacles at will, maintaining offensive momentum that the enemy cannot counter." The human dimension of this technological advantage appeared in frontline reports. American infantry received hot meals and fresh ammunition daily, delivered by DUKWs that German artillery could not effectively target. Wehrmacht soldiers subsisted on reduced rations and fought with weapons they could not properly maintain due to supply shortages. Technical superiority multiplied through operational effects. DUKWs could deliver replacement parts for damaged equipment, enabling American forces to maintain higher equipment availability rates than German units even during intensive combat. The vehicles also evacuated wounded soldiers faster than German medical services could treat their own casualties. German countermeasures failed systematically. Luftwaffe attacks against DUKW operations succeeded in destroying only 12 vehicles during the entire Rhine campaign, while American production replaced losses faster than combat consumed them. Wehrmacht artillery, designed to target fixed positions, could not engage effectively against amphibious vehicles crossing at unpredictable locations. The revolution was complete. Rivers had become highways for American forces while remaining impassable barriers for German retreats. The collapse of German resistance east of the Rhine revealed how completely DUKW operations had disrupted Wehrmacht's strategic planning. German forces that had prepared defensive positions for months found themselves outflanked by amphibious vehicles that appeared behind their lines, forcing hasty retreats that consumed precious fuel and equipment. American operational flexibility contrasted sharply with German constraints. While U.S. forces used DUKWs to establish supply depots anywhere along the Rhine, German logistics remained tied to roads, bridges, and rail lines that Allied air power systematically destroyed. The Wehrmacht's conventional supply chain became a liability against an enemy that needed no infrastructure. Statistics from late March illustrated the widening gap. American DUKWs maintained 94% operational availability despite intensive use, while German truck units reported 41% availability due to fuel shortages and spare parts deficits. The disparity translated directly into combat effectiveness and unit mobility. Colonel James Patterson, commanding the 459th Quartermaster Battalion, documented DUKW operations that would have been impossible for conventional vehicles. His amphibious trucks delivered artillery ammunition directly to gun positions on muddy riverbanks, supplied forward medical stations in terrain inaccessible to wheeled vehicles, and evacuated wounded soldiers from areas German forces could not reach. The psychological warfare aspect intensified German demoralization. Wehrmacht soldiers watched American vehicles emerge from rivers carrying fresh troops and supplies, while their own units waited days for basic necessities. The contrast reinforced perceptions of American industrial invincibility that propaganda could not counter. German attempts to adapt defensive tactics failed consistently. Anti-tank guns positioned to cover bridge approaches could not engage DUKWs crossing elsewhere. Mines laid at traditional crossing sites had no effect on vehicles that approached from unexpected directions. The Wehrmacht's tactical doctrine, refined through years of warfare, became irrelevant in days. By March 25th, German commanders acknowledged that the Rhine defense had failed completely. The river that was supposed to buy time for defensive preparations had become an American highway into the Reichs. Heartland, the Third Reich's last natural barrier, had been conquered by trucks. The strategic implications of DUKW success extended far beyond the Rhine campaign. American commanders recognized that amphibious vehicle operations had revolutionized river-crossing tactics, enabling rapid advances that traditional methods could never achieve. The vehicles had eliminated the Wehrmacht's ability to use natural obstacles as defensive positions. The human cost of this tactical revolution favored Allied forces dramatically. Conventional river crossings typically suffered 15 to 25% casualty rates among assault troops. DUKW operations at the Rhine achieved similar objectives with less than 4% losses, primarily due to the vehicle's ability to avoid concentrated defensive fire by crossing at unpredictable locations. German military doctrine crumbled under the weight of technological obsolescence. Wehrmacht training manuals contained detailed procedures for defending river crossings, fields of fire, artillery coordination, obstacle placement, but nothing addressed enemies that could emerge anywhere along hundreds of miles of waterfront. German officers trained in traditional warfare found their expertise worthless against American innovation. The industrial dimension of Allied victory became undeniable. American factories produced amphibious vehicles faster than German forces could destroy them, while Wehrmacht equipment losses could not be replaced. The Reich's industrial capacity, devastated by strategic bombing and resource shortages, could not compete with democratic production systems. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding the U.S. First Army, submitted reports to Eisenhower documenting the campaign's broader lessons. Amphibious vehicles have fundamentally altered the tactical equation, he wrote. Rivers which historically channeled military operations into predictable patterns can now be crossed at will. This capability provides overwhelming operational advantages. The psychological impact on German civilian populations compounded military defeat. Reports of American trucks driving across the Rhine spread quickly, destroying Nazi propaganda claims about invincible defensive positions. The image of Allied vehicles emerging from Germany's greatest river barrier symbolized the Reich's technological and industrial failure. By April 1, 1945, Wehrmacht resistance west of the Rhine had collapsed entirely. German forces retreated eastward, abandoning defensive positions that American amphibious capabilities had made untenable. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The Rhine campaign's conclusion marked a fundamental shift in military thinking about amphibious operations and industrial warfare. American success with DUKW vehicles demonstrated that technological innovation supported by massive industrial production, could overcome traditional defensive advantages more effectively than numerical superiority or tactical brilliance. Post-war analysis revealed the campaign's broader significance. Military historians calculated that DUKW operations enabled Allied forces to cross the Rhine 6 weeks ahead of conservative planning estimates, accelerating Germany's collapse and reducing overall casualties. The vehicle's success validated American emphasis on technological solutions to military problems. The human stories behind these statistics reflected individual courage supported by industrial capability. DUKW crews like Staff Sergeant Michael Romano of the 532nd Amphibian Truck Company risked their lives daily, driving into enemy fire to maintain supply lines that kept American advances moving. Their personal bravery multiplied through technological advantages that German forces could not match. German survivors' accounts, collected by Allied intelligence teams, described the psychological impact of facing an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources and technological superiority. Captured Wehrmacht officers repeatedly mentioned American miracle trucks that could drive on water, symbolizing their perception of insurmountable Allied advantages. The economic dimension of victory became clear through production statistics. American factories delivered 21,147 DUKWs during World War II, compared to fewer than 200 similar vehicles produced by all Axis nations combined. This disparity reflected broader industrial capabilities that determined the war's outcome more decisively than battlefield tactics. Allied commanders incorporated DUKW lessons into planning for future operations. The vehicle's success influenced military doctrine for decades, establishing amphibious logistics as a standard capability for modern armies. The Rhine crossing became a case study in combining technological innovation with operational flexibility. The campaign's legacy extended beyond military applications. DUKW technology influenced post-war civilian vehicle development, contributing to innovations in all-terrain transportation and amphibious rescue operations. The vehicle's versatility demonstrated the civilian benefits of military research and development. American victory had been achieved through democratic values, translated into industrial superiority. The Rhine crossing of March 1945 stands in military history as proof that wars are won, not merely through courage and strategy, but through the marriage of human determination and industrial capability. The DUKW operations demonstrated how democratic societies, mobilizing their full productive capacity, could overcome any totalitarian military machine. Veterans of the Rhine campaign carried with them memories of technological marvels that seemed impossible until they became routine. Master Sergeant Chen, who supervised DUKW operations throughout the war, returned to civilian life with profound respect for American industrial workers whose skills had created the vehicles that ended the war. Every truck that crossed the Rhine, he reflected years later, represented thousands of workers who never saw combat but won the war through their labor. The strategic lessons remained relevant for generations of military planners. Amphibious capabilities, refined through DUKW experience, became standard equipment for modern armies facing river obstacles. The vehicle's success established principles of operational flexibility that influenced military doctrine worldwide. German military historians, writing decades after the war, acknowledged the Rhine crossing as the moment Wehrmacht resistance became hopeless. The sight of American trucks emerging from the river symbolized technological and industrial superiority that Nazi ideology could not counter. Professor Wilhelm Steinberg of the German War College wrote, "The DUKW represented everything the Reich could not match: innovation, production capacity, and the democratic spirit that motivated free peoples to outproduce totalitarian systems." Today, preserved DUKWs in military museums remind visitors of the ordinary-seeming vehicles that achieved extraordinary results. Their simple appearance, truck-like bodies with marine propellers, conceals the revolutionary impact they achieved through careful engineering, and mass production. The lesson endures in the quiet dignity of these machines. American victory came not from superior weapons or tactical genius, but from the accumulated efforts of free people who understood that democracy's survival required the full mobilization of industrial civilization. The Rhine was crossed by courage, engineering, and the democratic faith that free societies could outproduce any tyranny. For centuries, the Rhine was more than a river. It was a frontier, a fortress, a myth written in water and stone. Roman legions once stood on its banks and declared it the edge of empire. Medieval lords built castles on its cliffs, confident that the swift currents below would shield them from invasion. Napoleon's enemies saw it as a wall to be defended at all costs, and German generals in both world wars believed that so long as the Rhine flowed, no army could breach the heart of their homeland. It was not only geography, it was psychology, a line engraved into the German imagination as surely as it was into their maps. By 1945, this myth still held sway. Even as Berlin burned in Allied bombing raids and the Wehrmacht retreated from every front, the Rhine promised a pause, a delay, a chance to regroup. Bridges had been demolished in retreat, towns on the West Bank reduced to rubble, artillery sighted to rake the opposite shore. German commanders reassured themselves that here, at least, the Allies would pay dearly. Crossing such a river required engineers, pontoons, fragile boats exposed to machine gun fire. Exactly the kind of conditions in which defenders might inflict heavy losses. The Rhine would slow the Americans, perhaps even halt them for weeks. But the war had already outgrown such assumptions. When the first DUKWs rolled to the water's edge, the logic of centuries began to collapse. These ungainly vehicles were not part of the German military imagination. They did not fit the calculations of the Wehrmacht's defensive plans. They were neither boats nor trucks, but both. And in that hybridity lay the undoing of an ancient barrier. 1,000 years of defensive doctrine was rendered meaningless by Detroit's assembly lines and Cleveland's engineers. For the men who rode the ducks into the Rhine, the crossing was not abstract history, but immediate sensation. The cold spray against their faces, the rattle of enemy fire, the groan of engines fighting the current. Many had doubted the vehicles. They looked like something a farmer might cobble together from spare parts, one GI later recalled. Yet as the ducks slid into the water and churned forward, fear gave way to awe. They kept moving. Shells fell, tracers stitched the night sky, but the ungainly trucks turned boats carried them onward. The river that should have swallowed them instead seemed to open a path. German defenders, crouched in bunkers, watched in disbelief. They had braced for rafts and pontoons, targets they could shred with concentrated fire. Instead, convoys of motorized craft came steadily, impervious to mud, undeterred by current. A soldier in one Volksgrenadier division admitted later, "We had been told the Rhine was impassable. Then we saw the trucks drive into the river. It was as if the earth itself betrayed us." Panic spread more quickly than the Americans advanced. Some units fought doggedly, others collapsed at the sight of what appeared to them as a mechanical tide. The irony was stark. Germany had invested its dwindling resources into wonder weapons, jets, rockets, super-heavy tanks, machines of terror and prestige. Yet it was the Allies' humble, practical inventions that decided the campaign. The DUKW was no marvel of engineering elegance. Its armor was paper-thin, its silhouette ungainly, its speed unimpressive. But it did what was necessary. It made rivers irrelevant. Logistics, not spectacle, proved decisive. Every duck that carried ammunition, fuel, and fresh troops across the Rhine extended the Allies' momentum and denied the Germans the pause they so desperately needed. By the end of March 1945, the Rhine crossings were secure. The Americans and British did not merely cross in isolated raids. They poured divisions across. Engineers soon threw bridges over the water, but by then the ducks had already made the river obsolete. The German myth of invincibility dissolved in the spray kicked up by propellers and truck tires. The psychological effect was immense. German civilians who had once sung songs about the fatherland's mighty river now watched as strange vehicles rolled ashore on the east bank. To them, it must have seemed like a dream inverted. Instead of defenders holding the line itself had been erased. The Rhine no longer protected, it betrayed. The end of the Reich was visible in every ungainly machine crawling up from the current. For Allied soldiers, the memory remained bittersweet. Some never made it across. Ducks were sunk by artillery or swamped by the current or struck by mortars midstream. Men drowned in the icy water, their gear pulling them down before help could reach them. Survivors carried those images long after the war. Yet there was also pride, even affection. The duck, once mocked as ridiculous, became a lifeline. Soldiers painted names and cartoons on their hulls, half joking but half reverent. They knew the ungainly craft had carried them not just across a river, but into the last phase of the war. In retrospect, historians often emphasize battles won by firepower, the tanks of Kursk, the bombers over Dresden, the rockets over London. Yet wars are also won by supply chains, by the ability to move men and materiel where the enemy believes it impossible. The DUKW was the embodiment of that truth. It symbolized the difference between a Germany exhausted by overreach and an America whose industry could supply not just weapons of destruction, but tools of movement, improvisation, and relentless advance. When the war ended, many ducks were scrapped, their usefulness seemingly over. Some found new lives as tourist craft in peacetime harbors, carrying sightseers instead of soldiers. Children laughed as they rolled from city streets into rivers, unaware that their ungainly ride had once been a machine of liberation. Others rusted quietly in depots, their metal hulls corroding, forgotten by all but veterans who remembered what it felt like to trust their lives to an amphibious truck in the heart of a war. And yet, in their very obscurity, the ducks preserved a lesson. The great rivers of Europe, once thought to be eternal barriers, had been reduced to obstacles no greater than a stretch of road. The Reich's last line of defense had been broken not by the sword, but by the wrench, the factory, the assembly line. Industrial ingenuity had turned the Rhine into an avenue rather than a wall. Standing today on the banks of the Rhine, it is difficult to imagine the thunder of artillery, the spray of mortar shells, the roar of engines echoing through the night of March 1945. The river flows peacefully past vineyards and cities, its surface broken only by tourist boats and ferries. Yet beneath that calm lies the memory of the night when the Rhine ceased to be a shield and became instead a witness to history's turning point. The DUKW will never occupy the same place in memory as the Spitfire, the Sherman, or the Mustang. It lacks the sleek lines and the glory of combat machines, but in its awkwardness lies its triumph. It was not built to impress. It was built to work. And in doing so, it became the quiet instrument of a decisive moment in the collapse of Nazi Germany. The Germans had believed rivers could defend them. The Allies proved that rivers could be crossed as easily as roads. In that revelation lay the end of the war in Europe. For when the Rhine fell, Berlin was not far behind. What is your perspective on this part of history? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every memory and reflection helps keep the past alive.